I'm Michelle.
And I'm Lucy.
Welcome to another Cameo episode. These short episodes will be slotted in between the other ones, and we'll cover people who made a fleeting and yet tantalizing appearance in other episodes. In this case, mentioned several times, because the Paston family.
Yes, the most famous letter writers in history.
Yes. We don't always have a lot of information about them, so they can't have a full episode of their own.
Well, we do, because they keep writing about each other.
Yeah. In this case, none of this works.
No.
It's a Cameo episode. Welcome.
It's a long Cameo episode about people who write a lot about themselves.
A lot.
And it is Margaret Paston, to be specific.
Margaret Paston.
Yeah.
Yeah. When we get... We don't have him on our list.
Who?
John Paston. He went everywhere.
Well, we've got him in here, but we haven't got him specifically. We've only got him in relation to Margaret.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been reading snippets about him all the time, things he wrote in these letters. I'm surprised we don't have an episode for him.
Okay. Right, that's another one then. It's not as if we're not already swamped with them.
Yeah.
I have to admit, she falls a tad outside our timeline since she died in 1483. But
that's okay.
As we often say, it's our podcast. We do as the damn well please. And she nearly made it. She was only 2 years out.
Yeah.
The Paston letters give us an insight into everyday life for a single family over the period of 1422 to 1509. So they are
a fairly
godsend.
wealthy and influential family, I should say.
Yes, they are by this point. They weren't. John Paston, who married Margaret, was 2 generations away from being bondsmen. So they really did pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
Yes. By meeting and working with the correct people. Mm-hmm. And inheriting things.
Yes, we're going to come to a bit of inheritance.
Okay.
I would think that Margaret must have regretted it, but we'll come to that. It's a big saga in their lives. In fact, it takes over their lives.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we've done anyone else whose life, feelings and family relations have been so minutely documented. Particularly the family relations. I mean, they're quite fun, really. She's really quite scathing about her children.
It's lovely, I think.
As you say, they were an important family in East Anglia, and they had links with several big names in the area, mostly through litigation.
Yes.
Sometimes through military action. The British Museum bought the letters in the 1930s, and they were digitised in 2015, which was...
Yes, and they are available online for free if you want to read them.
Mm.
It will take you a bit to learn how to read them. Just FYI.
Yeah, once you get your eye in with these things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Margaret Paston was born in Reedham in Norfolk, and this was a wealthy area. Norwich was second only to London in wealth, although I'm pretty sure we heard the same about Bristol, so...
Yes.
And I'm sure other towns will say, no, hang on a minute.
Yeah, it was us.
Yeah, it was Taunton, surely. Does everything else. When Margaret was only 2, her father died, making her his sole heir, which was probably a way of ensuring her dowry, I should think. The money's locked in then, isn't it?
Was she his only child?
She must have been, otherwise...
I hope so.
Yes, otherwise it's... unless this not liking your children thing passes down the generations like the Georges.
Like the Georgians.
We don't know whether she ever learnt to write. Probably not, despite being one of the most famous letter writers. She got her sons and even her servants to write them for her. Her eldest son was a great bibliophile and a great disappointment to his parents.
Oh.
Yes. Margaret dates her letters using the liturgical calendar, so it's a bit complicated for us modern folk. For instance, she mentions on the Thursday before St. Thomas's Day. So as a reader, you've got to know your way around the liturgical calendar as well.
Mm-hmm.
Agnes Paston wrote to her husband in 1440 or so, we don't quite entirely sure, to tell him about the meeting between their son John and Margaret Mortby. Both families were keen that the two should marry, and in the letter you can tell that Agnes liked Margaret. she said that Margaret was courteous to John, which you'd feel would be the least you'd expect. She's not going to come barging in and start abusing him. But she doesn't mention her son's reaction to Margaret. But then she wasn't vetting John, she was vetting Margaret, so...
Yes.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter how they felt.
Not really.
No.
I mean, it helps, because otherwise you're going to have your offspring or daughter-in-law or whatever constantly writing to you saying, you never guess what he's done now. Sometime in 1440, Margaret and John got married. John spent much of his time at the Inns of Court, which was sad for Margaret because she missed him, but great for us because it meant lots of letters.
Yes, and I love that. I love that we know that they were happy together for her to miss him. Well, she was happy.
She was happy.
One side of it.
I did wonder whether he was. I just don't know. I don't know enough about him, but there are a few times when you think, oh, come on, John. Why are you in London? And she's having to put up with all of this. But perhaps that was just how families worked.
That was the way.
Yeah. Margaret and Agnes got on very well. Even when Agnes and John hit rocky patches, which they frequently did, the two women remained friends. And Agnes was still churning out children when Margaret had her first one, so she was a great source of help and advice.
Gosh, could you imagine? Your eldest is married and you're still having children.
Mm. No, I don't really
rough.
want to imagine that, really.
No. You'd be having babies right now.
I don't think so. No. Agnes had written to her husband, William, to get a girdle for Margaret. You've mentioned this before, haven't you? Since her pregnancy meant that none of her girdles fitted her. And William claimed that he'd passed the message on to John, but Margaret didn't believe him. She thought he'd forgotten. And in fact, both William and John had a habit of forgetting these things. Because there were all sorts of things you couldn't get in Norwich, you could only get in London. They were sending constant letters to husbands saying, while you're in London, could you pop over to so-and-so? Yeah. And they'd say, yes, dear, and then probably forget, I think.
Yeah, it's also interesting for maternity wear. Most of the dresses meant you could let them out to accommodate maternity, but she must have been quite large, pregnant, and quite slender, not pregnant, for them to require a new girdle.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Because normally you just open up the lacing, but the lacing can only go so far.
Yeah, well, she didn't ask him for extra long lacing.
No.
Then, yeah, that's interesting how you can extrapolate.
Mm-hmm.
Margaret sent John a ring with a picture of St. Margaret as a reminder of her. But she told him, quote, "You have left me such a reminder that makes me think of you both night and day, when I should like to sleep," unquote. I think the little one is kicking her in her bladder as the babies are wont to do. Margaret of Antioch was the patron saint of pregnancy and childbirth due to the legend that she was swallowed by a dragon, and when she crossed herself, she burst out through its belly. I mean, that's not what you want to think about when you're about to have a baby.
No. It's more like aliens than a baby.
By her fourth pregnancy, Margaret Paston signed a letter to John, quote, "By your groaning wife," unquote. I don't think she ever got used to it. Pattons were wealthy enough to be able to employ a midwife for Margaret, not the norm in less wealthy families. Unfortunately, the midwife who was chosen, Elizabeth Petherill, was incapacitated by sciatica at the time of the lying in, but she said she would get there when she was needed, even if she would have to be wheeled in a barrow. So you could have this image of, while Margaret's giving birth, Elizabeth Petherill is sort of dictating what should be done from her wheelbarrow. And the thing I didn't realise is that women who died during or soon after childbirth might not be buried in consecrated ground.
Yes, because they have not been churched.
They haven't been churched, and it's generally down to the sinfulness of Eve in the Garden of Eden. You know, it's not bad enough that you're dying in childbirth anyway, but to be told, well, that's because you have inherent sin.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cruel, I thought.
Yes, very.
But their son John was born in April 1442, so a successful delivery. Their second son was born in 1444, and he was called John.
John, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, this annoyed the heck out of me. They went with different middle names, but the first name was John.
Yep. So it's not that the first one's died, it's just a sort of fail-safe, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, he's only 2 years old. There's plenty of time for disaster to hit, so we better have a spare John. It's almost as if the Pastons are deliberately making it difficult for us.
Well, didn't George Foreman recently?
All
His
the kids
are all George.
They're all George, yeah.
Yeah. It's totally confusing.
Yeah. I must have had nicknames for them.
Yeah.
Or he couldn't remember any of their names and thought, I know what will make it easier. It's a bit like making sure you've got all socks of the same colour and therefore you don't have to worry about pairing them up. Just call them all George and you don't have to remember their name.
Yeah.
I'm going to call the elder boy elder son John and the second one younger son John, and the husband will just be John.
Okay.
While Margaret was expecting the second son John, her husband John became very ill. She wrote to him suggesting that he come home as soon as he felt well enough, since he'd be cared for just as well at home. So obviously she's thinking London doctors are probably better than Norwich doctors, but you wouldn't have the tender loving care of a wife.
Yes.
Her family offered to take her back to her mother's while she was pregnant, and she declined. She was worried that not being home would delay any news about her husband's health. Now, it's hard to tell whether that was because she really, really loved him, which I think she did, or whether it was almost a trope of marriage that you show everybody how much you are giving up for your husband.
For your husband.
Yeah. Don't know. It's these things that are so hard to... Unless you study lots and lots of marriages at the time. Yeah, did people with unhappy marriages give up so much for their husband? I don't know. You would have to find out.
I don't know. I'd love to see the letters between different ones. Instead of entirely beloved, it's only my beloved wife.
Yes.
Or my wife.
Yes. By the end of the decade, Margaret had other worries. She wrote to her husband in autumn 1448, asking him to send not girdles and a hat for little John or anything, but crossbows, windlasses, pole axes and jacks. And jacks is an armoured jacket. She suggested he borrow them from Sir John Fastolf, who was their friend and the subject of a future Cameo episode. The castle at Gresham, where Margaret and the children were living, needed defending from their enemies, and John was in London managing the legal aspect of the assault. So she's in the front line. We think she was pregnant with her eldest daughter, and he's in London. So anyway, what happened? Why are they at siege? Well, the situation had arisen when Margaret's father-in-law had died. A man called John, another John, Hautane, initially claimed the right to Agnes's property, the mother-in-law. This dispute dragged on over several years, and it also dragged in the property where Margaret and John lived, Gresham, because this had been given to them by John's father, William, who had bought it from Thomas Chaucer, the poet's son, on their marriage. And then in 1448, Baron Hungerford asserted his wife's claim on Gresham. And he took it by force when John and Margaret were away.
Yeah, wait till they leave and then go claim it.
Yeah. Well, the following year, Margaret herself was attacked by 1,000 of Hungerford's men. I wonder if it could possibly be 1,000 or whether she looked out and thought, that's a lot. Probably 1,000.
Yeah.
John petitioned Henry VI about it. Hungerford had blown up the gate and knocked down the walls, and he had found Margaret with 12 other people whom he chucked out of the castle. And the place was then ransacked and destroyed, and the tenants terrorised. And Hungerford's men said that if John had been there, they would have killed him. So it's no wonder Henry VII decided to clamp down on liveried retainers.
Yeah.
And when a powerful man could muster an army to attack his neighbours to get his hands on their property, I mean, it's anarchy.
Yeah.
And, yeah, I did wonder about John's role in this. I mean, yeah, he's a lawyer, not a fighter, but I suppose it does make sense that he work on the legal aspect of it. But to leave his wife and mother and children to protect the property against armed marauders,
But that was also expected. We found that with one of the other women.
I mean, they've got their retainers, their own retainers and their servants.
Yeah.
But still, must have been worrying. Well, I hope it was worrying for him, in a way. Margaret then moved a mile away to the home of their friend John Dan, and she wrote to John from there, not mentioning her own horrific experiences, but she told of their servant Kate, who had been sent with a message to Hungerford's men, who were at that point threatening the tenants. And Kate went because, as Margaret said, quote, "I could get no man to take it," unquote.
Ooh.
So I hope they felt bad as they watched little Kate striding off to talk to 1,000 armed men.
Who quite often had rape as the spoils of war.
Margaret warned her husband that he wasn't even safe from Hungerford's men in London, and warned him against going out alone. She and her mother-in-law had been abused in the street and called plain whores and threatened with death.
Ooh.
She quickly realised she wasn't safe where she was with their friend and escaped to Norwich on the pretence that she was going to get new clothes made for her and her children, because she'd heard that Hungerford planned to kidnap her. John and Margaret won their case over Gresham, but by that time it was so battered they couldn't move back in, and it was never rebuilt, so it wasn't much of a victory.
No.
Just a moral one, really, I suppose.
Well, they'd still have the income from the lands around it.
Yeah, that's true. They just can't move back in. Margaret sent John letters with strict, very strict instructions about clothes to buy for the children. She described in detail the type of cloth she wanted and where to buy it most cheaply, and sent him bits of lace for him to match up. You sort of envision hordes of men wandering around London clutching bits of lace.
Yes.
Looking completely perplexed. Bear in mind, while Margaret is writing this letter about bits of lace and things, she was in the midst of this dispute with Hungerford. So evidently...
Yeah, you're that worried about lace that you're going to do that in the middle of being besieged.
I suppose it shows life goes on, doesn't it?
Family
life goes
lace
on.
Lace is pretty luxurious.
Yeah. By 1451, Margaret and John were living in Norwich and still looking for somewhere permanent to live. And then, while John was away, an illness hit Norwich. Margaret referred to it as pestilence, so we don't know if it's actually plague or a general epidemic.
Yeah.
Margaret wrote to her husband saying that both she and their daughter Marjorie had got it and were very ill. And she told him that some of the people they knew in the city had died from it, including Margaret's uncle, who died in terrible pain.
Oh, dear.
It's not the letter John really wants to receive, is it?
No.
We're both very ill. Everybody else has died, and it really hurts. Thankfully, Margaret and Marjorie survived. It could have been plague, since Margaret asked her husband to get a pot of treacle, since that was meant to be a cure for plague, amongst other things. Treacle cost 16 pence, which was 2 days' work for a skilled artisan. Half a pound of twopenny rice, half a pound of treacle. Yeah, I was trying to work out if that song did the cost of it, but... Margaret seems to have been the physician for the whole family. The younger son John wrote to Margaret asking for a compress to treat knee pain and asking her how to use it. So John might have had the better education, but it was Margaret that he looked to for advice on medicines. And Margaret and her friends sent medicines and recipes to each other, as women did.
What is it? Oh, the garden... The garden is my apothecary and my wife is my doctor.
Ah.
Is that the saying?
Not heard it. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, that was what it was, wasn't it, in that time? Margaret seems quite the diplomat when approaching her husband. He seemed like quite a prickly character, I thought.
Oh, really?
I didn't warm to John. I liked Margaret, didn't warm to John. A friend and neighbour, Lady Felbrigg, had claimed to be very much on the Paston side with their dispute with Hungerford. But John had heard rumours that one of her servants had made derogatory comments about him. He wrote to Margaret to get her to find out what was going on, so she talked to Lady Felbrigg, and then wrote to John to tell him that her ladyship didn't know about the business with her servant, but would admonish him about it. Margaret added that at dinner, Lady Felbrigg and her friends had, quote, said they would all have been all the merrier if you had been there, unquote. So I think women at this time often managed to diffuse politically inflamed situations. But it did seem almost like talking to a child, didn't it? We'd all have been a lot happier if you'd been there, John.
Yeah.
Honestly. I mean, we had a nice time, but in fact, we had a very nice time. In 1453, Margaret of Anjou came to Norwich. And Margaret wrote to John to tell him that a friend of hers, Elizabeth Clear, had talked to the Queen, and the Queen had advised her friend to remarry, since she had the ideal man in her retinue.
Oh, don't do it.
So Margaret of Anjou is setting her up on some sort of blind date by the sound of it. Although she didn't seem to have talked to the Queen, Margaret was part of the celebrations around the visit, and she wrote to John complaining that she had to borrow some jewellery from Elizabeth Clear for the occasion, quote, because I dare not, out of shame in my beads, go in the midst of so many lovely gentlewomen who were here at the time, unquote. And she tells John to get her some jewellery as soon as he can. She mentions that she had already asked him a few months ago, but nothing came of it.
And now you've embarrassed me.
Well, yeah, it's not just she wants something pretty. It's jewellery reflects your social status. If she'd turned up in her beads, they would have taken her as of lower status than she was. And
yes,
that would reflect on John, as I'm sure she probably mentioned to him a few times.
More than once.
Margaret borrowed money from Elizabeth Clare on several occasions, mainly on behalf of her sons. On at least one occasion she struggled to repay a loan that she'd taken out for her younger son, John. But borrowing from your friends wasn't a sign of being on the breadline. It didn't have the stigma because there were no banks for ordinary people. Where else are you going to borrow money?
Yeah.
So although we might feel awkward borrowing from friends, we've got alternatives. 1454, Margaret and John were living by this time in Elm Hill in Norwich, which is still a very beautiful cobbled street. Looks much the same, actually. And there's a blue plaque showing the site of the Paston family home. Not the house, just the site, because the house was destroyed by fire in 1507. Which is a pity, because they'd made lots of alterations. They'd done lots of refurbishments on it.
Yeah, I would have loved to have seen it.
And Margaret had to supervise while John was away, and she mentions having got some roof beams from one of John Fastolf's men. Their home was to include a malt house, bakehouse and brewery, which was the norm in townhouses of that class.
That malt house must have smelled so good.
Yeah. Not necessarily the brewery, though.
No. A malt house is where they prepared the barley for the beer. So you'd spread it out, pour water on it, get it to start germinating. You keep making it closer and closer, like into a pile, so it stays warm. And then you get it to just the right spot, and then you kill it by heating it up. But during that time, it smells so fresh.
Yeah. Much of the news in the letter Margaret sent to her husband was to do with the renovations. The room John wanted as his counting house and office, as well as his bedroom, which was interesting. People did often sleep apart, didn't they? But you'd think, with him being away so often...
Yeah. That he wouldn't have a separate...
Yeah. Well, Margaret said it was too small. Not all his furniture would fit in. He'd have to carry on using the room he was already using. It's all these little things that you might well write in a letter now. Say, the builder didn't turn up. I'm afraid we haven't got the windows in, all this sort of thing.
Yeah, it'll only take a few weeks. It's been 3 months and we still haven't seen the doors. Don't know where they are.
She also reminds John that he was to find his sister Elizabeth a good match before he came home. You get the impression she's saying, or don't come home.
Yeah.
John seems to be reluctant to hand out a larger dowry for Elizabeth, and that seems to have been the problem with finding her a suitable match. She was already in her mid-20s, and there'd been an attempt to get Elizabeth off their hands a while earlier with Stephen Scrope. And I couldn't work out, I did look it up to find out if he was any relation to Rolf Scrope of Upsall and Masham.
I was just going to ask.
There was a Stephen Scrope, but he was much, much earlier. So I couldn't find this one. So John Fastolf's stepson, he was. Elizabeth had put her foot down about this match. For a start, he was 30 years older than she was.
Ooh.
He's a widower, And also, she had heard that he was, quote, unattractive, unquote.
Oh, dear.
Yeah. He'd had an illness when he was young that left scarring.
Smallpox, I'm assuming?
Probably.
Mm.
It wasn't just that. Scrope would have no inheritance from his family until Fastolf died, and he was heavily in debt, which is not a great way to start a marriage.
No.
But what was really holding back the betrothal was that the Pastons weren't sure who would inherit Scrope's money and property when he died. Elizabeth said she wouldn't marry him unless she was sure it would be their children who would inherit. But there was also the possibility it might be the daughter from Scrope's previous marriage.
Mm. So wait, she's setting herself up to be the perfect stepmother of no, you're getting nothing.
Yes. Yes, you know that money you thought you were getting? No,
yes.
It's going to my kids.
Yes.
Yes, it's not a great... several reasons for this marriage to be a bit of a disaster. However, Agnes, the mother of Elizabeth and John, was very keen on the marriage. So much so that she kept Elizabeth prisoner in her home to pressure her into agreeing to the match.
Ah, see, we've heard this before.
We have, yes.
And girls even got beaten if they didn't agree.
Yeah, she did. She got beaten several times a week, it says. And,
oh, my goodness.
It was really horrific. Even Scrope was kept away from her, which seemed to defeat the object a bit.
They didn't want him to see the bruising.
Possibly, or unless he was really that unattractive.
Holy cow.
Yeah, no, it's horrific. Elizabeth did manage to get a word out through a friar to Elizabeth Clear, who seems to be everybody's good friend. She then told Margaret what was happening. Not just that she was a prisoner, but she was also being physically abused by her mother. Quote, her head had been broken in 2 or 3 places, unquote. Now, presumably that means bleeding in 2 or 3 places rather than fractured skull in 2 or 3 places. Elizabeth Clare wrote to... I'm sort of alternating between Clare and Clear, aren't I? Elizabeth Clare wrote to John asking him to find another match, if only to get the young Elizabeth away from the family home. It wasn't unknown for parents to chastise their children, but Elizabeth Clare's intervention implies that she thought it had gone too far.
Yes.
Agnes must have been a very formidable character, since Elizabeth Clare asked John to burn her letter since she didn't want Agnes to know she'd written to him.
Wow. Unless what she's actually thinking is the damage that's going to happen to Elizabeth, the daughter.
Could be, yeah.
Wow, what brutal. Brutal.
Yeah. Scrope knew a thing or two about child abuse as well. He wrote later that soon after Fastolf had married his mother, he had illegally sold the boy. Quote, he bought and sold me like a beast, unquote.
But they all did, wardships.
Yeah, we haven't heard from the other side at all.
Mm-mm.
We often wondered what the kids thought. Well, this is
obviously
what the kids
they
think.
didn't like it.
Yeah. And even after Scrope came of age, Fastolf had continued to deprive him of his inheritance.
Ah, yet another stepfather trope.
It's presumably why he was in debt and was having to wait for Fastolf to die. In 1458, Elizabeth found a place in service in the household of the Poles, or Pools, however you like to pronounce it. I'm going to stick with Poles, I think. Not the sort of life she had maybe been expecting, but at least she was no longer being a financial burden on Agnes.
And getting beaten.
She did then marry a few months later to Robert Poynings. Presumably one of the family. Although, again, I tried to find a link, but it was a bit difficult to work through the family tree. And he was an interesting choice, because he'd been part of Jack Cade's rebellion, for which he'd been imprisoned.
Ew.
And he'd only been pardoned a short time before marrying Elizabeth. And he then disappeared, presumably dead, fighting on the Yorkist side at the Battle of St Albans. So, yeah, that came and went.
Yeah.
Elizabeth then sought the help of John Paston after she had been dispossessed of her lands by Poynings' niece. I say it's a litigious time. I mean, it really is. People are in court all the time.
Mine now. Yeah, they really did love to sue each other.
Later, she would make a very lucrative match to George Brown, a member of Edward IV's court. And he was part of Buckingham's rebellion against Richard III, who was executed and attainted.
Oh, my goodness.
Elizabeth was also part of the rebellion, but she was pardoned. So she does seem to have gone for rebellious types.
Yes.
Yeah, she's made a few interesting choices there.
Mm-hmm.
1459, and at the end of the year, Sir John Fastolf died. John had been employed by Fastolf as part of his legal team, and the two men had become close friends, with Fastolf acting in a paternal role.
Mm-hmm.
Which is ironic, given how he treated his own stepson.
Yes.
John had been called to Caister Castle, Fastolf's residence, where he stayed until the old man died. John then announced that Fastolf had named him as his heir as his dying wish. But this was only an oral will with nothing written down. And you think, well, what about Stephen Scrope? He's been waiting for this moment all this time, and then John leaps in and says, not only can't you marry my sister, but I'm taking that, yeah.
Yep.
The will that had been written down a few months previously expressly warned against people who would claim to be his inheritor after his death. And even though there were at least two other people in the room, the priest and the physician, and presumably members of the family, no one else heard Fastolf handing over his fortune to John.
I don't trust John. I have a feeling he's going to do this, so I will warn you about it. And then he goes ahead and does it. Awesome.
Yeah. However, John took immediate control over Caister Castle and Fastolf's other properties.
Wow, the gall of people.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. I didn't warm to John.
No.
Yeah, so obviously, what's that you say? What's that? I can have it all. Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. And it's...
Oh, he died.
Yeah, he died. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. Fastolf had decreed that much of his wealth should go to the building of a chantry at Caister, so that prayers could be said for his soul. So he's still taking his money away from his stepson. Yep. You can't have it. It's going all to be for prayers for my soul. But John was chief mourner at the funeral. He probably made sure he was. And he was at Caister that Christmas and didn't go home to see his family, presumably on the idea that possession was 9/10 of the law.
Yes.
Since the other executors were challenging his claim, so he'd best stay put. This was to drag on for years, with the Duke of Norfolk staking a claim too. It seemed that anybody who was anywhere near said, oh no, it was me.
No, it was mine.
John spent his Christmas making an inventory of Caister Castle. Yes, he might as well see what he's inherited. And this wasn't the first time John had muscled in on an inheritance. Agnes claimed that John had said that his father, William, had handed over everything to his eldest son on his deathbed again. He's sort of hovering around just, oh, what did you say, father? I can... Agnes complained that that was not what William had told her he wanted. The previous will had been more generous to her and to John's younger siblings. And Agnes never forgave John for the way he treated his family.
Really? Agnes never forgave him for the way he treated the family. She's the one that was beating her daughter.
It's all right to beat your daughter, but just don't take the money from the family. Yes.
Wow.
Slight double standards with Agnes, I think.
Yeah.
And Agnes is still very friendly with Margaret. So Agnes doesn't hold against Margaret that she's married an idiot.
Who is?
You get the feeling that poor Margaret was often piggy in the middle between John and some member of his family. Wow. Margaret believed John's story about Fastolf, though. Maybe she had to, or maybe she just convinced herself. She had no doubts they were entitled to Fastolf's property, and she wrote to John telling him that she'd been seeking advice from her friends about the appropriate forms of entertainment for their new rise in status, and also the appropriate ways to celebrate Christmas following a bereavement. I mean, you can't look too happy about it, can you, when the man's died?
Yes.
This is, I don't know, I felt this was the sort of thing they'd have known innately, but perhaps not if you suddenly get a jump in status. You can't Google it, can you?
No.
You've got to ask someone. So she sent her two sons, the two Johns, to various elevated houses to ask what would be acceptable. And she was told, quote, there should be no dressing up, nor harp, nor lute playing, nor singing, nor any loud pastimes, unquote.
So no celebration.
Well, not really, but as far as Margaret was concerned, that Christmas wouldn't be very joyful anyway, because she missed John that Christmas. Quote, "I consider myself half a widow because you are not at home," unquote.
Oh, ouch.
1462, again, John hadn't been around for Christmas, and he hadn't written. Margaret wrote, quote, "My heart will never be at ease until I have news of you," unquote. And she had reason to be worried, since a couple of months earlier, John had done time in the Fleet prison.
Right. Forgot about this.
for failing to respond to a royal summons. He was only there a few days, but it drew attention to who his enemies were, because the Duke of Norfolk and Sir John Howard, the High Sheriff of Norfolk and Suffolk, had sort of knocked on him.
Yep.
This was to be the first of many stays in prison.
Yeah.
Largely due to his claim to the Fastolf property.
Yes, almost all of it was.
And this gave rise to depression in John, which he must have communicated to Margaret, since she was very afraid for his mental health.
I wonder what type of prisoner he was. Did he have enough money to be in the upper floors where he had a room and a servant, or was he still, because he didn't actually have access to Fastolf's wealth, down with all the dregs?
Well, that's what I was wondering, whether he could get his hands on Fastolf's money to pay for the perks.
Yeah, perks of prison.
Yes, she was worried about him. Quote, "If you think it might do any good in your business if I come up to see you, once I know your intentions, it will not be long before I am with you," unquote. And she did go and see him, accompanied by her daughter Marjorie, in one of the very rare excursions out of Norfolk. She's a bit like me. She doesn't leave the county very often.
Yeah, I'm comfortable here.
Margaret was very afraid that John was too trusting and that this would get him into trouble. I don't think it was so much that he was too trusting. He doesn't sound trusting, does he?
No.
I think it was really he didn't know who to trust. And she was worried that, because not everyone was upfront about how they felt, and allegiances were shifting all the time. So I think she was worried that he would unburden himself to somebody who would then turn the tables and join somebody else.
Yeah, with that information that he now had. Yeah. Gosh, so glad I don't have anything to do with this kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think I have enemies.
No.
I don't think so.
Don't want any, thank you. Just treat everybody nicely and you'll do fine.
Yes. Don't claim other people's inheritances. That seems to be the secret. John had written to him previously, warning him that there are enemies in the Wars of the Roses, and you said, forget that's going on, because there's so much else for violent nature going on. John Hayden and Sir Thomas Tuddenham, sounds very Dickensian to me, Thomas Tuddenham, were out to get both him and his property. They'd been allies of the late Duke of Suffolk. She was also afraid of the uprising among common people, which was made worse by the fact that John wasn't there to protect his tenants. The tenants were refusing to pay their rents, so I'm not sure if she means protect or to, be a bit heavy-handed with them. She said there had never been as much robbery and manslaughter.
Oh.
There were rumours that George, Duke of Clarence, and John de la Pole would be coming to Norfolk to stamp down on the rioting, and that's the John de la Pole from the third episode, that we've said did nothing, absolutely nothing.
And nothing at all.
Apart from when his son rebelled and he rushed to the king saying, "Nothing to do with me."
No, that's my son. I am fine.
But we see a bit of a different side to him here, because this made everyone even more frightened, since they didn't trust the type of justice that Duke of Clarence and John de la Pole would administer.
Right.
They thought they would just tar them all with the same brush and sort of hang the lot of them. Margaret told John that John de la Pole and his mother, Alice Chaucer, were widely considered to be lawless and tyrannical, and she accuses them of financing all the traitors and extortionists in Norfolk. Now, I had to bear in mind there was a property dispute with the Chaucers.
Of course there was.
So she might be overdoing it with her comment about Alice Chaucer, but it's certainly a different side to John de la Pole. He didn't always roll over and have his tummy tickled.
Mm-hmm.
During the Wars of the Roses, the Pastons' most powerful ally was John de Vere, the father of our John de Vere. And the greatest threat to the family was John de la Pole, as we've seen, and also the Duke of Norfolk. So they've got powerful friends, but they've got powerful enemies, yeah.
Heavy hitters. Yeah.
The Pastons, having initially been Lancastrians, changed sides, with their elder son John serving in the court of Edward IV, and the younger son John, rather strangely, serving in the household of the Duke of Norfolk. I couldn't entirely make that out, because the Duke of Norfolk was often at loggerheads with the Pastons, and yet their son was in his household.
Yeah, how does that work?
I don't know, unless they're doing a Stanley.
Trying to... Yeah, maybe.
I mean, it's the Wars of the Roses. It's not a bad idea to have...
One on both sides.
To spread your people around, yeah.
Yeah.
Then after Bosworth, they changed back again, siding with Henry VII.
Yeah, but I'm just thinking, Norfolk hates you.
Yeah, and you hate Norfolk.
Doesn't he hate the whole family? Why would he accept him? Because now you're accepting what could be a spy in your household.
I couldn't make that out at all.
I don't understand.
Having said that they were on the side of Henry VII, the younger son John fought at the Battle of Stoke and was knighted there. 1463, there was a rift between Margaret and her husband, this time, brought about by their eldest son's behaviour.
Oh dear, this does really sound like the Georgians. We're getting more and more into that.
It is like a soap opera as well, isn't it? Oh, I'm very worried about my son. I've fallen out with my husband. Mm-hmm. And my house is at siege by 1,000 armed men. I mean, it's just like a soap opera.
Yeah.
Margaret and the elder son, John, were at Caister Castle, while husband John was again in London. And there were several people contesting John's inheritance, and so someone had to be at Caister to protect it. But elder son John had then up sticks and left. And it might not be his fault. He might have joined Edward's forces when Margaret of Anjou had landed back in England with her son. So, I mean, it's not as if he's just gone on a little holiday or anything. He's been summoned. Yeah. The problem, as far as Margaret Paston was concerned, was that husband John thought she'd allowed elder son John to leave. John thought she'd taken her son's side against him. He's so touchy. It drives me mad, this husband.
Yeah.
She told their son to write to his dad to make it up. And there's a lot of this in Margaret's life. Oh, sort it out, please. I can't stand it.
Jeez.
But the son left it for 4 months before trying to patch things up. And by that time he was back in Norfolk. John told him to stay there. Don't go running off again. So it's, there's a lot of don't tell your father about these relationships. All right, you can do it, but don't tell your father.
You gave me 45 P's instead of 46 P's. That's the way it sounds. That kind of prickly pear.
She was worried. Margaret was worried that her son wasn't budgeting properly. So she tried to pry into his financial affairs. But she was keen that husband John, shouldn't know about it. See, it is very much don't tell your father.
Yeah.
She's worried about the son not looking after his money properly, but she doesn't want to tell the husband. I don't know, maybe because she thinks, oh, God, I can't be bothered. He'll only kick off about it. And we'll never hear the end. So I'll sort it. Or she thought he'd blame her for their son's inability to look after his money, which is also a possibility. And it does seem very strange that she's still writing to him to offer advice, despite the fact the son is already in his 20s, he's in the service of the king, and he'd been knighted, and she's still writing to him saying that, I'm not happy about the way you're looking after your money. Listen to me, mother knows best. But that was very much of the age, because a man left childhood at the age of 12, but nobody thought he'd reach maturity until he was 30. I mean, men seem to have a lot of leeway there.
Yeah.
Up to then, he was still under the jurisdiction of his parents.
When did this saying come out, boys will be boys, but girls must be young ladies?
I don't know.
That saying come
but
around?
That does seem to be the case, doesn't it? I mean, a woman is expected to be ready to run the family, the household, pretty much from the age of about 14, really.
Yeah.
Or 12, isn't it?
12 in some cases.
Elder son John wrote to his dad to explain why he was short of money. because he said living at court was very expensive. There was a standard
it
to maintain.
was.
It was,
Yeah.
yes. But because his dad wasn't at court, he didn't appreciate that these weren't fripperies he was doing. He was keeping up the status about like Margaret and her beads and her jewellery.
Yeah.
You sort of got into the situation where you had to do it.
And most people at court were in debt trying to keep up appearances at court.
But you can't get out of it, can you? You can't.
Well, no, we
somewhat
did have... Who was it that we covered? Oh my gosh, we have spoken about so many people that they couldn't come to court because they didn't have the right clothing.
That was John de la Pole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I thought. So yes, you could beg off by saying, well, I don't have the money. Although that might have been utterly humiliating.
Oh, I'd have thought so.
Yeah.
Well, the other one was Edmund de la Pole, who wasn't allowed the dukedom because he hadn't got the money to keep up the appearances for the dukedom. So the de la Pole family has just got money troubles all the way through.
Sounds like everybody has money troubles.
Yes.
It really does.
And then Edward IV summoned both young Johns to a military expedition against the Lancastrians in Northumbria. So they were to bring, quote, as many persons defensively arrayed according to their rank, unquote, and enough money for 2 months.
Then we've got the question of what is their rank? Has the Fastolf stuff been decided and did they get it? Because that was going to increase their rank. But at this time, that would be a perfect excuse to say, nope, because you haven't sorted this out, my lord. I can only bring you one man and a mouse.
Yes. And the man's only got one arm, so yes, it's... Yeah, I don't know. Interesting. But if we do John's side of it, we can look more into the actual financial aspect. I've looked more with Margaret into the family quagmire.
Yeah.
The fact that none of them get on with each other. And she's just as bad, as we'll see in a little while. I wrote to John asking if it was all right if elder son John could go. So it's obviously, I don't know if she's sort of mocking the husband a little bit, saying, you kicked off so much last time. Is it all right if he goes this time?
Even though he's been ordered to by the king?
Yes. And also, when we heard about men being arrayed for battle and at the call of the king, we never thought before that they had to ask their mum if they could go.
No, that's right. Mummy, Mummy, I've been asked to go to war. Can I go to war?
After you've tidied your room. Yes. Unfortunately, the relations between John and his eldest son deteriorated, and the young man was thrown out of his parents' house for a year.
Wow.
And he lost his pocket money. So I don't know how he was managing to keep up appearances then. John thought that the boy was lazy. He likened him to a drone. All the other bees collect honey, but the drone just uses it for himself. I'm not sure that's a particularly accurate view of life in a hive.
I don't know.
But it was quite a mean thing to say about his son. Margaret tried to plead her son's cause, but John complained that fathers brought up their children until the age of 12, and after that they were meant to be an asset to their father, not a drain. Which seems quite a naive point of view. I mean, I've got 3 children, and I think that's a very naive point of view. At this point, Margaret felt that John was being unfair on their son, but later she was to agree. Yeah, the boy's lazy. 1465, Margaret was at Helston helping the tenants there and showing by her presence that it was Paston property.
Yes. It's so funny that you could claim property because you were there. We came across that before. I am here, so it is mine.
Yeah, but I only popped out for a pint of milk. One of Suffolk's men had grabbed a horse from one of the tenants while he was out ploughing, and the tenants retaliated by stealing horses from them, and this all soon escalated, as probably it was meant to. Suffolk arrived at Helston with 160 men-at-arms, which is what makes me think that the Hungerford thing of 1,000 must have been, her saying there were loads.
Yeah.
Margaret went to the Bishop of Norwich to seek his help. The main advice the bishop gave was that John should come back. Was it? Or was this Margaret saying to John, oh, the bishop says you should come back?
You won't listen to me, so...
Yeah. Quote, and he said to me that your presence should do more for them than 100 men should do in your absence, unquote. Yeah, it does seem odd. I mean, there's 160 men going there. And, yeah, I think if I were John, I'd want to be there with the family.
Yeah.
Margaret was guarding Helston while her elder son John was guarding Caister. Trouble is, they've taken on so much that they've got to have members of the family guarding. Right, you go there, I'll stay here.
You should have had a few more Johns.
Yes, right, okay, when they move on, you quickly run to this one. Margaret stayed at Helston for months until she was evicted by force. And by this point, I couldn't help wondering what the rest of the family really thought about John's claim that he was the Fastolf heir. It was bringing them nothing but trouble.
Yeah, financial and physical.
Yeah, I mean, they'd inherited these properties, but they're constantly having to defend them.
Mm-hmm.
And when they finally get them back, they've been completely trashed.
Yep.
Not only had John fallen out with his eldest son, but he was at odds with his mother, Agnes, again.
He sounds like such a lovely person, although Agnes I'm not too fond of after everything that happened with Elizabeth. Not so pleasant of a family at this time.
No, they're a nightmare family, I think, the Pastons. And Margaret seems to have married into it and desperately trying to keep it all together and keep everything sweet.
Can't you be like
up to
my
a point,
family?
So.
We love each other.
Margaret said there was so much gossip about his falling out with his mum that she felt it was impinging on John's other businesses. You know, people were saying, well, you know, if he can't get on with his mum...
Oh, yeah?
No smoke without fire, you know, about this. Everyone says he shouldn't really have the inheritance. The problem was that Agnes claimed that her husband William had realised that his will would be unfair to the younger son, and he'd then rectified this by saying that the younger son should get a bigger percentage of the inheritance. So this is still dragging on. And Agnes complained that although John knew about the addendum, he refused to act on it. And he even took his father's valuables that were in Norwich Abbey and got the deeds to the properties without Agnes's knowledge. So you can see why she's cross.
Yeah, but I don't know.
Well, William had said more of this should go to Agnes and the other kids. And John had just said, no, I'm having it all.
Because I'm the eldest.
Yeah, and taken it without anybody knowing. Agnes wrote, quote, my son, John Paston, seems an odd way to refer to your own child, but...
Well, when you're angry.
Yes, my son, John Paston, never had any very kind words to say to me, unquote. Yeah, I feel there's bits in there that we're not hearing about that she's done.
Yeah. If you treated your daughter like that, how were you to the rest of your children?
But she only put this down in a legal document after John was dead. While he was still alive, she tried to persuade him to follow what she said were the father's wishes.
Well, yeah, of course. You can't... If you said that while he was alive, you're never going to get what you're hoping for.
Well, that's it. She needed his support.
Yeah.
And, yeah, as so many people seem to with John, she's just sort of walking on eggshells around him. Agnes sent John her blessings at the end of one of her letters, but this was dependent on him being kind to his brothers. The Pastons always seem to be disappointed in their sons. Margaret and Agnes remained close, and it was to Agnes that Margaret fled when Gresham was taken over. In 1455, Margaret was still trying to fight off the Duke of Suffolk's men. She wrote to John, quote, what with sickness and trouble that I've had, I'm brought very low and weak, unquote. She begged her husband to sort out all the disputes, since she feared they would shorten her days.
Oh.
But John doesn't seem to be in any position to do that, since by the autumn he was back in prison.
You really could have avoided all of this if you hadn't been greedy.
Yes. He's ruined his family's lives, really.
Yes. Yes, he has.
He might have thought he was doing it for the family, to take them up a notch, but... Yeah.
Or maybe they were completely destitute without it. We don't actually know.
Maybe, yeah. And maybe that's why John was saying, right, I'm having it all. There's no point us sharing it because we'll all have nothing.
Yes.
At least I'll have something.
I will be fine.
So I'm sure you'll all be very happy for me. While John was in prison, the Duke of Suffolk arrived in Norwich in person. He ordered the mayor to flush out any Paston supporters and punish them. The Duke claimed royal support, which presumably made the Paston supporters traitors. At least one of Margaret's supporters was threatened with execution.
Jeez.
And all this over property.
Yeah.
Margaret wrote to her husband to get him to use any influence he had to get the man released, which is nice. I mean, she's in enough trouble with herself, and she's worrying about this man. These arrests weren't legal, since there was no warrant. You know, if you're the Duke of Suffolk,
You just do it.
Yeah. Margaret found herself very much alone, since few people dared to side with her. Suffolk's men destroyed one of her properties and then sent the bailiffs to move in and took all the stuff. So there's another one gone. Margaret sent John an inventory of everything that was taken, which must have been hell for her, but very useful for historians. She was most shocked that Suffolk's men had violated the church.
That is a surprise.
And she suggested to her husband that he talk to men of the king and tell them to come and take a look, see what these people have done.
Go to the cardinal or the bishop. Like, hey, they're taking
she
the
seems to be on
church's
good
property.
terms with the bishop.
Yeah.
In January, Anthony Woodville, Lord Scales, seized Paston's properties at Caister, North Norwich. Yeah, you think,
does he get
he's got
involved?
it.
Oh, no. Darn.
Yes, it just seems that everyone's just piled in and said, well, I'll have one. You know, if they're going. On 22nd of May, 1466, John died. And infuriatingly, given the number of letters that have passed, just the number of letters we have that passed between John and Margaret, none survive from just before John's death, so we don't know the exact circumstances. We know that he was at the Inns of Court in London when he died, and he had no members of his family with him, which, you know, in some circumstances you might have thought was a great relief.
Yeah.
He died of an illness, and it must have been quite sudden, since it seems to have come as a bolt from the blue for Margaret. Although she thought it was all the disputes and stays in prison that had killed him.
It probably was. He could have caught a disease, yeah.
Yeah. And he might have been a little lower if he were depressed as well. I mean, that doesn't help.
Yeah.
Constantly worried. The cortege walked for 7 days back to Norwich and then on to a priory in the village of Paston. Now the elder son, John, was head of the family, and Margaret was now ostensibly under his authority. However, because he wasn't married, effectively Margaret had the same position as she had when John was alive. And she wasn't at all sure that her son was up to the job. They have a very low opinion of this man. He's a man, not a boy. 1469, the disputes of the inheritance continued. So John might be dead, but they're stuck with this now.
Yeah. And they can't renege it. They can't just say, you know what, enough is enough, keep it. Just keep it.
Yeah, they can't say, actually, Fastolf didn't say anything of the sort.
Yeah.
He was lying. It'd be interesting to know if he did say that, Fastolf. If not, it's a very gutsy move on John's part.
That's the reason I want a time machine. I just want to go get answers.
You'd have to stand beside Sir John Fastolf's deathbed, though, to find out.
Well, I could go back as like a fly on the wall. Nobody can see me.
Or get John Paston very drunk and say, go on.
Listen.
What happened, really?
Yeah.
Margaret was now involved in the important task of finding good matches for her children. Her elder son negotiated a marriage into the Woodville family. You wouldn't think you would after Anthony Woodville had just nicked your house. Margaret had her reservations. The marriage didn't happen, but it's not known whether it was Margaret who put her son off the idea. Then her daughter Marjorie planned to marry their bailiff.
Ooh.
Not only was he her inferior, but it took Marjorie off the marriage market so she couldn't be used to make useful alliances for the family.
Yeah. Please tell me Margaret didn't beat her.
And we don't hear of that,
Okay.
but then we only heard of it before because Elizabeth Clear stepped in.
Yeah, and we've got a letter saying, please help.
Margaret tried to get Marjorie into service, either with Margaret, Duchess of Oxford, or Jacquetta of Luxembourg.
Ooh.
Which is an odd choice, given Jacquetta's own morganatic marriage. I mean, she'd married below her.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think she would say, you want to marry a bailiff? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Margaret did this because, as she wrote to her son, quote, "We are both tired of each other," unquote. We don't know precisely what she meant by this because she told her son that they would talk about it when they next met. That's very annoying. Marjorie also said that the younger son, John, had supported the match, which was much to his annoyance since he said he'd known nothing about it and wouldn't have supported it in a million years. He said it would reduce his sister to, quote, "selling candles and mustard in Framlington," unquote. So obviously that's the worst thing he can possibly think of. Margaret tried to prevent the liaison by spreading false rumours about the bailiff and intercepting their correspondence. It does seem extraordinary that the family had so little power to prevent the union.
Yeah. Everywhere else, they just say no.
Well, Marjorie and her hunky bailiff made a secret marriage alliance.
Uh-oh.
And a letter from the bailiff to Marjorie that has passed down to us, despite the burn after reading plea, in which he suggests that the Paston family should be excommunicated for keeping the two of them apart, since they were going against the solemn vows they had made to each other.
That's incredibly gutsy, because he's their bailiff. They are paying him. They are his employer.
And it's not very fair, really, because at this point they didn't know he and Marjorie had got married, because Marjorie hadn't plucked up the courage to tell them. When Margaret was told, she determined to have the marriage annulled. And she wanted to prove that the promises weren't valid because she felt that the right words hadn't been said.
Had it been consummated, is the question. They managed a secret marriage. Did they manage to consummate it?
I don't know. Doesn't take long.
No.
Nip out the back. So, right, Mother, too late. She and Agnes went to see the Bishop of Norwich, and the bishop said that nothing could be done unless he heard Marjorie's side of the story, which is what happened. She came before the bishop, who reminded her how important it was to be guided by her family. And she very bravely told the bishop what vows they had given each other and said that if the wording wasn't right, they would do it again and make sure the wording was right this time. The bishop then interviewed the bailiff and concluded there was nothing the family could do. The two were definitely married in the sight of God. Well, there was something Margaret could do, and she disowned her daughter and cast her out of her house. And interestingly, it was the bishop who found somewhere else for her to go. So he sort of took her under his wing a bit, and it was with a grocer and sometimes mayor in Norwich.
Why doesn't she end up with her husband?
She does, in a little while. Yeah, she was sent to a convent to start with after that, but then she was reunited with her husband. And well, hopefully they were happy, since she had given up a hell of a lot to be with him.
Yeah. You can imagine that coming out with every argument. Do you know what I gave up for you?
Yes. Yes, dear.
Yeah.
Margaret wrote to her elder son, John, telling him not to grieve about the loss of his sister, since, quote, "in losing her, we have only lost a Brethel," unquote.
What's a Brethel?
Now, a Brethel was a contemptible and worthless person, and it has an etymological link with brothel.
Oh.
So also harlot.
Harlot. Oh.
We don't know if Marjorie and Margaret were ever reunited, but strangely, the bailiff went back to working for the Paston family.
Oh.
Which must have been
Awkward.
had some awkward moments. Quite apart from these worries, the Duke of Norfolk had used the upheavals caused by the Earl of Warwick and George Duke of Clarence coming back to England and taking King Edward prisoner to lay siege to Caister Castle. Well, I'm not sure why they're bothered about that anymore, since Anthony Woodfield took that one over. It's getting very confusing about which they've still got left. I think sometimes they manage to turf people out again.
Yeah, and get back in there.
Quick, in through the back door.
Just catapult me into the second floor. There's a bed on the other side of that window.
Yes. The younger son, John, defended it, but they were running out of gunpowder and arrows. And Margaret heard that Norfolk's men had sent out for more guns. She exhorted her elder son to negotiate as quickly as possible, even if it meant losing Caister Castle. I mean, she's fed up with this by now. She's thinking, just take the damn thing.
And this was not unusual. So, as a woman, you were screwed no matter what you did. If you were poor, then you could end up in a brothel. Well, no, middle class seems to have a bit more freedom. But being anybody in the aristocracy or landed gentry, we've been reading that this happens a lot. The women don't go with their husbands, not necessarily because the husband doesn't want them there, but that they have to defend the home. It's not a fun life.
No, it might have been quite pleasant before he did what he did, but it's not pleasant now.
But it's now been years of this.
Years, yeah.
Ugh.
And it's, well, she thinks it's killed her husband.
Yeah.
She says it's taking years off her.
Yeah.
And not in a good way. I don't mean in a, it's taken years off me. I mean, it's taken years off the end of her life.
Yes.
Yeah, the elder son then wrote to his younger brother to reassure him that the Duke of Norfolk had promised that even if he got the castle, he wouldn't hurt anyone within it. Now, if you remember, the younger brother had been in Norfolk's court when he was younger.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's why Norfolk said he wouldn't hurt anyone. He knew him when he was a boy. I mean, it seems a bit much to knock him about now. I mean, it's so incestuous in a way. I mean, all living in each other's houses.
Yeah.
And yet fighting. They were forced to surrender, and the younger son John and his men left the castle. So the Pastons have lost Caister again, although they did reclaim it after Norfolk died.
So they just started it all up again. Oh, God.
1470, now it's Margaret's younger daughter who was causing her worry.
The daughters are the biggest problem. No.
No. There seem to be different sorts of worry. The daughters seem to choose the wrong men, and the sons seem to just be generally rubbish as far as she's concerned.
I'm just surprised the daughters get to choose. They have any option to choose.
Well, it's not what she's choosing at the moment, because Anne is in the household of Sir William Kelthorpe. But in 1470, Sir William wrote to Margaret asking her to take her daughter away. Okay. He said this was just a matter of economics. He was struggling to collect his rent and so couldn't afford such a large household. Okay. Also, he said it was time that Margaret found Anne a husband. In the letter to her elder son John, Margaret said she wasn't sure that this was the reason that Sir William wanted Anne out of the house. Quote, either she has displeased him, or he has caught her out in some wrongdoing, unquote.
Really? So she automatically assumes her daughter's at fault?
Yes.
Good mom. What the heck?
And she didn't want her home.
I don't want to pay for her.
No, she said, quote, she will often annoy me and cause me anxiety, unquote.
Oh, what a nice mom.
Yeah, oh, don't come home. You're annoying.
Yeah, I finally got rid of you.
This seems a very harsh way to refer to a daughter, but it doesn't seem to be uncommon. Often young women who are either single or widowed could be made to realise very quickly that you're a financial burden on your family.
Wow.
Unfortunately for Margaret, there was to be a certain amount of déjà vu, because Anne had also fallen in love with someone her social inferior. He was a retainer working for the Pastons. So they don't look very far. They just look around and say, well, like you. He must have been very loyal, since he'd risked his life in the siege of Caister Castle, and he'd stayed with Margaret's husband in the Fleet prison. Which was all very commendable, but that still didn't make him suitable son-in-law material.
No.
The Pastons were determined to stamp on this relationship, and he was sent away, and negotiations were started for Anne to marry William Yelverton, whose grandfather had opposed John's claim to the Fastolf properties. But then you're probably running out of people who hadn't opposed his claim. I think the reason for this choice was to reconcile the two families. The younger son, John, was very keen to get his sister off his hands. Quote, I will provide for her, even though she's not my daughter, unquote.
She's your sister.
She must have felt really welcome in that family. They're saying, right, we're not going through the business we went through with Marjorie again. We're stamping down on this right from the start. You are not marrying this man. The negotiations for the marriage to William Yelverton were not plain sailing, because Yelverton said he would take her if she had the money, but if she didn't, he wouldn't. So that's the far cry from the love match with her retainer. So there was 5 years of financial wrangling.
5 years?
But eventually the two were married.
Wow.
Yeah. 1473, Margaret's second younger son, Walter, was going to Oxford University. And Margaret asked her chaplain to take him to Oxford and make sure he was settled. It just seems to be so, I don't know, modern really. You know, she's worrying about her little boy going off to university. Will he be all right? Has he got the right stuff? She told the chaplain to look after him because she would be more reluctant to lose Walter, because she hoped to have more joy of him than she'd had with his elder brothers.
Oh, wow.
The few letters we have from Walter mainly consist of requests for money, since he'd had to borrow from his tutor. Luckily, he is her favourite son, because otherwise she'd be thinking, oh, not another one.
Not again.
Margaret had relied on her chaplain more and more after John's death. And this caused friction within the family because her sons thought the chaplain was pushing them out. I don't know whether she thought she couldn't marry him, so I don't know, they felt very intimidated. They were determined to have it out with their mother. Margaret wrote to the younger son, John, quote, "I don't need to be told any such thing. I can work things out in my own mind," unquote. I think she probably added, "Thank you very much."
Yes.
He wrote to his elder brother complaining that Margaret was just starting arguments with him and his younger brother Edmund, just so they would leave her house.
Everybody, out. I've had enough.
Well, she's obviously just saying, have you seen my book of hours? No, Mother. I bet you have. I bet it was you. Where did you put it? I haven't had it. Well, I think you probably have. I'm just deliberately picking
I just
this
got
up.
here. I've been away for 4 weeks. Why would I move it?
Why are you picking on me?
I haven't even come through the door. Yeah.
She does seem to be not a welcoming mother. Oh, it's you again, is it? Ugh, you're back. Edmund wrote, quote, "We fell out with thou proud priest, my mother taking his part," unquote. Margaret started doing the whole Agatha Christie matriarch thing of telling her children that she was going to rewrite her will. So, think on, boys. They may have had a point about Margaret's reliance on the chaplain, because even when he was given a benefice elsewhere in Norfolk, Margaret went too, living in a village quite close. I mean, she was practically stalking him.
Ooh.
Sadly, that November he died. I mean, we've just done episodes on Caterina Cornaro in the Patreon episodes, so if we were still doing her, you'd think, poison, definitely poison.
Yep. Definitely poison.
I don't think he was poisoned, but he does conveniently seem to have gone. Her children weren't exactly heartbroken by this.
Nice.
Maybe they were worried that their mother had fallen in love with the chaplain. I mean, she's on her own again.
Yeah.
Or they were afraid that he'd convince her to leave it all
to the church.
Yeah. Elder son John wrote to younger son John, quote, "Beware from henceforth that no such fellow creep in between you and her," unquote.
Lock her up.
Yes. It does seem rather sad for Margaret. I mean, she's not going to have a chance to look elsewhere, is she, with the sons checking up on her the whole time. 1477, younger son John was in the midst of negotiations to marry Marjorie Brew. It's very annoying that everyone's called Margaret or Marjorie. These negotiations were faltering due to wranglings about money. Yes. Younger son John complained that it was Marjorie's father, Sir Thomas Brew, who was at fault for not putting forward more money. Sir Thomas said that elder son John was the head of the family, so it was up to him. Margaret, as usual, piggy in the middle. She wrote to Marjorie's mother, Elizabeth, suggesting a meeting. And Elizabeth wrote back saying that her daughter was a prize that she wouldn't part with for £1,000 since she wanted to keep her with her, and that she was only agreeing to the match because she had respect for Margaret and her son. And possibly £1,000, I'm not sure. All right, we'll give you 1,001. Done. It might just be a trope. Be grateful that we're giving you such a wonderful girl and don't ask for so much money. Or it might show that not all mothers wanted to get their children off their hands, like Margaret did.
Yeah.
Younger son John was at Bru's family home when he sent a letter to his mother, enclosing another letter that she was to get someone to copy out for her, and she was to send it back to Elizabeth, John's prospective mother-in-law. And this was so Elizabeth wouldn't know who had actually composed the letter. Because this said that any problems with the negotiations were nothing to do with John, and was all the fault of his older brother. So the two brothers have fallen out now. And she was to say, quote, "Madam, you are a mother as well as I," unquote. And she was to remind her that she had other children. If you forked out a fortune on younger son John, what would the even younger sons think if she couldn't afford to spend as much on them? He also sent Margaret another letter for her to copy out, and this one was to be sent back to him as if it had come from her.
Okay.
This was so he could then show it to his prospective parents-in-law. And it said that if negotiations were to fall through, quote, "I would feel as sorry for her as any gentlewoman living," unquote. So a bit of emotional blackmail there. Do you want your daughter to be miserable? Well, luckily they were married and lived very happily together for 20 years.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Somebody's happy.
Yeah. Well, he's happy with her. Marjorie's happy with her bailiff. I'm not sure Anne's particularly happy with her one that said he would only have her if she had the money.
Yeah.
In one letter we still have, Marjorie wrote to John, quote, "It seems to me a long time since I lay in your arms," unquote. And that seems quite a
nice
modern
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not usually quite as specific as that.
No.
She took many of the roles that Margaret had done, and they had several children, and she died in 1495. An interesting side note about the younger son, John, was that he had been part of the entourage for the diabolical Duchess herself, Margaret of York, when she went to Bruges to marry Charles the Bold.
Ooh.
Not relevant to his marriage particularly, but I just noticed that and thought, 1478. As usual, Margaret and her eldest son, John, weren't getting on because he hadn't erected a suitable memorial to his father. In fact, his grave was unmarked.
But they didn't like each other.
No. There seems to be a touch of Francis Lovell. He didn't get on with his dad, did he? And
Nope.
refused to get prayers said for him. Margaret didn't just see this as a slap in the face for her husband, but people were gossiping about it.
Yeah, it does kind of bring down the family's name.
Yeah. She sent her son some cloth of gold for him to sell, with strict instructions that the money he should get for it were for the completion of the tomb only.
Oh, you shouldn't have done that. Should have sold the cloth yourself and arranged for the tomb. That's never going to happen now.
Yeah, Her son assured her, quote, "There'll be none like it in Norfolk," unquote. Or maybe he's saying, "There'll be none in Norfolk."
Yes.
I've no intention of doing it. But Margaret wasn't convinced because he wasn't great with money. Quote, "If you sell it for any other purpose, then, upon my honour, I will never trust you as long as I live," unquote.
You shouldn't trust him now. So, does he do it?
I think he does.
Oh.
I think so. Actually, that story just sort of fizzles out because it's not mentioned again in the letters. And I think if he hadn't done it, it probably would be.
Yeah, oh, it definitely would.
Yes. Since his last wedding negotiation had fallen through, he was now looking at another potential suitor related to the Woodvilles. And Margaret, who really does seem to have had a very poor opinion of this poor man, wrote that he should only progress with his plans, quote, "if you can find it in your heart to love her, and if she is such a one by which you can have children. Otherwise, upon my honour, I would rather that you never married in your life," unquote.
Oh.
So I suppose she's thinking, well, I loved my husband. I don't know, did that make her happier? I was about to say, so that was a happy thing, but I'm not sure. Since
Maybe
he was
it
never
just
there.
made it easier for her to tolerate him.
Yeah. We know that she knew about her son's other lovers. And at least one of them was a Paston family servant. So, shocking for the sisters, not so much for the brothers. His other lover, Constance, had given birth to a little girl, also called Constance. Margaret had taken some responsibility for her younger son, John's little boy, Jack, but it was the younger son, John, and Marjorie who took in Constance. So they just seemed to be swapping each other's illegitimate children about.
Oh, gosh.
But Margaret remembered her in her will. So that's quite nice, I suppose. They all take them in, and whether they take them in to say, oh, you're like a daughter to us, or don't you ever forget that you're the illegitimate one.
I'm just thinking they're going to fight that. The family's going to squabble over that money.
Yes. Yeah, well, she can't have it. Margaret's son, Edmund, also had an illegitimate son. His situation was even more complicated since the mother was married and the husband agreed to bring up the boy as his own.
What?
Which was nice of him.
Yeah.
When the husband died, the boy became a ward of the crown. Edmund couldn't claim him because the boy was officially the husband's son because he'd claimed him before. So the family knew what happened if you didn't claim your children, your illegitimate children. Mm-hmm. So the elder son, John, would have wanted to lay claim to his daughter Constance, so the same thing didn't happen to him. He didn't lose her. 1479, favourite son Walter finished his degree. Good lad. He's a good boy, isn't he?
At least he got something done.
Yes, he did. Yeah, before being properly ordained, and when he was only 23, Margaret got in touch with Dr. William Pickenham, Archdeacon of Suffolk, to say that she wanted her son to have the benefits of Mortby, her home village. However, Pickenham pointed out that her son was not yet qualified, was too young, and her proposal was illegal and, quote, neither goodly nor godly, unquote.
Ooh.
So that was telling her.
Yeah.
Imagine getting that letter. You think, oh, has he got it? What?
Mm-hmm.
Walter did graduate and had a big dinner party to celebrate. However, just 2 months later, he was dead.
Oh.
He fell ill in Oxford and was taken home. So, at the same time, Agnes died. And so too did the elder son, John.
Oh, jeez.
All of them probably died of plague.
Oh, ouch.
That must have been devastating for Margaret. In quick succession, she'd lost her favourite son, her much-loved mother-in-law, and, that other one.
That other one.
Margaret retreated to Mortby. She was increasingly incapacitated by illness. In February 1482, she drew up her will. In it, although she didn't give any money to her wayward daughter Marjorie, she did leave something to Marjorie's son, inevitably called John. She also asked that her household in Mortby should only be dissolved 6 months after her death, and this would give her servants time to find positions in other households.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
I never thought that would be in a will. Okay.
It shows that it's not the norm, so you have to put it in, so that
yeah, true.
Your kids don't just think, right, you lot, hop it. I'm not paying your wages. She wrote her epitaph to be put on her tomb. Here lies Margaret Paston, late wife of John Paston, daughter and heir of John Maltby, Esquire. And, then brackets include the date of her death, on whose soul God have mercy. No mention of being a proud mother, you notice.
Very true. I didn't notice that.
Yes. You'd think you would make some comment about them.
Yeah, no,
I mean, other families have all their little offspring kneeling by the tomb. There's a lovely one in a village, Curry Rival, up the road that has got the family all beautifully painted. I mean, it's a bit later, they're all wearing ruffs, but yeah, no mention. So that was the surprisingly modern-feeling story of Margaret Paston.
Yeah, very soap opera-ish with the family falling out constantly.
Constantly
You're right.
falling out, yeah. Yes, and her just saying, I don't want you home. Go away.
Yeah.
You've left home now. You've flown the nest. Now just stay away. I mean, it's...
Yeah, don't come back.
Yeah.
Why are you here?
I'm always very happy when my children come back, which they do frequently. Yeah, I'd never say to them, go away.
In a letter.
Yes. Which I then keep for posterity.
Yeah. Wow.
So, yeah, we should do, John. See it from
Yeah.
his side.
Yeah.
He's probably full of letters to his friends saying, oh, God, she's writing to me again. She's given me some more lace. Oh, and it's Walter this, Walter that. Isn't he great?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for listening.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.